labour market and on the policy response that we saw reacting to the pandemic from central and local government. You can get all of those on our website. And today we're going to focus on how the pandemic has affected trends in office space supply and demand, the housing market and the retail industry, and what this means for their future. And we've got a great panel to discuss these issues, and I'll introduce them in a moment. As always, before we start, a few words of housekeeping. The event is being recorded and will be made available on our website after the event. If you want to tweet about the event, the hashtag is COVID2YearsOn. You can post your questions and comments throughout the event, and you do this via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we will be done by 1 o'clock. So that's the context, the background, and what we're going to be discussing. Let me introduce our panel. Our first panelist is Lawrence Bowles. Lawrence is the Director of Residential Research at Savills. Our second panelist is Andrew Mercer, who is the Office Sector Lead at Legal and General Investment Management. And our third panelist is Helen Dickinson. Helen is the Chief Executive of the British Retail Consortium. Each of them will take a few moments to set out the stall in terms of what's been happening in their industries and in their sectors. And then we'll get into a bit of a conversation about how this all comes together. So without further ado, Lawrence, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'd like you all to cast your minds back a little more than 2 years to the 23rd of March, 2020. That was the day we had Boris Johnson standing up in front of the nation and saying that due to this mysterious and terrifying new virus, we'd all have to be spending a lot more time at home, only allowed out once per day for essential exercise and shopping and so on. That triggered a few changes in the way that we lived, or more than a few changes in the way we lived. But particularly, as we were spending so much more time at home, it really changed our relationships with our homes. It was no longer just a place to sleep or to recuperate. Those homes also became our one place to work, to play, to relax, to socialize, whether that's over Zoom or over the phone or whatever. And as a result of that, we saw a number of changes to the way that people chose to live and the places that people wanted to live. A few months later, in May, the housing market reopened and we saw a rush for more space. Whether that was people moving to the suburbs or moving further afield, there was a real increase in demand for homes that had access to green outdoor space, that had space to work from home, and crucially for many families had space to accommodate the homeschooling that would become the bane of many parents' existence over the following 2 years. It's a long time since all of that happened. A lot has changed since then. We've seen the stamp duty holiday come and go, which may, for the short term at least, have encouraged many people to upsize to properties that they previously would not have considered. We have seen continued support for new house building through the Help to Buy scheme and through further support for house builders. But since then, things seem to have started to ease off. As somebody who currently has COVID, I can say that COVID is very much not over, but at least if you read the government's guidance, the restrictions on what you can and can't do with COVID and with testing and so on are much less restrictive than they once were. As a result, we've seen a renewed demand for homes that are in areas that are not just well connected to green space, but also to local amenities as well. We found there that if you ask the buyers in our regular survey, we survey our buyers fairly regularly to work out what their priorities are, 23% of them listed as their number one or number two priority, being close to a local pub or restaurant as being their top priority when finding their ideal place to live. That's up from just 12% back in September of 2021. So as things have reopened, that benefit of being near those amenities has become a much greater attractive force, and that's drawing people back into those towns and cities where you can access those shops, where you can find somewhere to work, where you can find somewhere to go out for a drink without having to drive for 20 minutes first. So what does all that mean for city centre living and for living in urban areas, for living in cities and towns? Well, clearly the demographics, clearly those demands have changed somewhat over the last couple of years. For families in particular, that demand for space has driven them out to suburban and rural areas. But there is still very strong demand, as we see it, for homes in those cities and in those larger towns, particularly for two groups. First of those is for younger people, those people who are more likely to be earlier on in their careers. They're more likely to benefit from the mentorship, from the networking, from the sort of learning from their peers that they will get from working directly with their colleagues, sort of face to face with each other in an office or in a shop or in a sort of face to face environment. The other side of that residential demand in cities, as we see it, comes from the older side of the demographics. They're older households who are looking to downsize, but also need access to the amenity and the community that cities can provide. So with that, we can expect to see that while the demand for cities is changing, it's certainly very strong, and we can expect to see a great deal of interest and a great deal of growth for residential demand in cities going forward. That's a whistle-stop tour on the residential side. Thank you very much, Andrew, for that intro.
Brilliant, thanks, Lawrence. Definitely come back, get into a little bit more of the detail, and interesting to get your sense as to whether the trends that we've seen are in the last 2 years are essentially continuation of existing trends, or whether there's something fundamentally different on that. So ponder on that while we hear from Andrew and then Helen. Andrew, give us the what's been going on, how the pandemic has affected from a kind of work point of view. It's probably the area, along with everybody's going to leave cities to live, that the second area is everybody was going to leave and work from home and such. But I mean, what's the reality of it? Give us the work perspective, the office perspective.
Yeah, Andrew, thank you, and good afternoon. That there's no doubt that COVID has sped up that structural change in working habits, and that's being shown in utilisation rates. But we don't believe it's going to have as much of an impact on overall leasing demand as perhaps others are saying in the market, and we believe that for a number of reasons. First of all, jobs growth. Over the period of the pandemic, there was actually 200,000 office-based jobs that were created, and Oxford Economics predict another 500,000 jobs being created over the next few years. Secondly, densities, office densities, we think they will reduce. So historically, we occupied offices at about 1 person to every 12 square meters. That reduced down in some serviced offices to below 1 person to every 5 square meters. And we can see that moving out now. And just to put that into context, most air conditioning systems are designed for 1 person for every 10 square meters. So you can see the impact there on experience. So we can see that moving out and people wanting more space. Thirdly, there will be a greater demand, I think, for collaboration space, and certainly pre-pandemic, one of my bigger challenges day to day was trying to find meeting room space, and we can see that changing and being more vibrant collaboration and meeting areas within our offices. And finally, occupiers will want a greater experience in their offices. They're going to want greater quality, all the way from the way we manage noise within our offices. If some people are speaking online and some people are having face-to-face meetings, all the way through to the amenity that's provided both within our offices and within cities as a whole. So what does this mean for offices going forward? Well, I think the first thing to say, as Lawrence alluded to, it's probably too early to say. There are a lot of people still struggling with the latest variant of COVID. And our occupiers are taking time, I would say, to work out what this all means for them. They need a period of sort of consistent utilisation so they can work out what works for different roles within their organisations. It's very difficult to measure productivity and whether one role works better at home or one role works better in the office. And that needs a little bit of exploring, perhaps, before those decisions could be made. But it's worth just bearing in mind that we are in a period of really low unemployment. There's no doubt the negotiation is very much in favour of the employee rather than the employer. But that won't last forever. And actually making decisions now based on that could cause problems in the future if that negotiation stance were to change in recruitment. So what we're seeing is occupiers not rushing to make decisions unless they have to. Clearly, if occupiers have lease events, they need to make decisions. If they don't need to make decisions and they can stay where they are for a few more years, or there's the opportunity to use flexible space, and we're seeing a real growth in that flexible space at the moment, partly because of this, then occupiers are not making those decisions. And the impact of that is that there is a growing pent-up demand for offices going forward for new Grade A space. And coupled with that is, as I alluded to before, a real flight for quality, both to create experience, but also around creating a sustainable office environments. And we still have, coming into the pandemic, we still have a relatively low supply of new developments coming online. You can take this all the way back to the referendum in 2016 when developers stopped working on site. So we've got low supply coming through, we've got increasing demand, and that's only going to have one impact. That there's a lot of talk about green premiums at the moment on good quality, sustainable buildings. And I suspect, if anything, that's being underestimated at the moment. So moving sort of more into the medium term, perhaps, and what this might mean, I do think that to create that experience, employers will be looking for a location that has a much more mixed use amenity within it. And I do think that that part of that experience will be linked to public transport and being able to get as many different groups of talent together in one place. And that the only real locations that can provide that is city centres. So we are positive about the future for offices within city centres. But I would just sort of finish by challenging as to whether it's actually going to be COVID that defines that going forward, or whether actually it's going to be sustainability and what wider ESG and technology, and how much of a bearing that's going to have, in things like transport and electric vehicles, etc.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Again, loads of questions I think spring to mind from that. I'd be interested to get your thoughts on, amongst other things, when you look across the occupier spectrum, really, whether there are different occupiers are stressing certain things or certain locations or certain attributes more than other types of occupiers. So just have that in mind when you talked about it. And I think this flight to quality, I think, is always an interesting question. What does that mean? But also, what does that mean for places or products or buildings that aren't in the top level of that quality? How do they need to respond? Anyway, so we'll come back to those sorts of issues. Helen, the retail industry clobbered over the last 2 years in some respects, and obviously trends beforehand making it a difficult physical operating environment anyway. But just your thoughts on what's been happening and then how places in the industry are responding would be brilliant. Helen, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll sort of start by talking a little bit about sort of retail generally and then bring it back to the sort of cities question. But if even pre-pandemic, there was a fundamental sort of transformation going on in terms of the way that we all shopped. There were tens of thousands of fewer shops over the 10 years up to 2020 before the pandemic actually hit. Online was growing in its proportion across the industry to about 6 or 7% of retail transactions in food were online, and about between 25 and 30 in non-food at the beginning of 2020 before the pandemic hit. And then suddenly, with this sort of major shift of half of the industry being closed for various big chunks of time over the subsequent 2 years, the sort of digital revolution that was already underway, and the shift, if you like, in terms of physical versus digital retailing was accelerated by, I mean, I can't even work out what factor, but the proportion now, as it stands, in terms of food, is double what it was pre-pandemic, and in non-food, it's gone from about 25-30 to about 45 to 50% of our purchases are online. And I think, again, just thinking about it generally, pretty much most of the retailers that I talk to do not think about them as two separate channels anymore, because I think one thing that the pandemic forced the number of businesses to do was to really think about what their investment in their digital offering looked like, and picking up on what Andrew mentioned, technology, how technology actually really underpins that offer, and whether there is more that they can do in their physical space and its connectivity with the digital space. So generically speaking, the whole idea that we've got sort of two separate channels and stores are one and online is another, we as shoppers don't think like that, and actually more and more retailers are thinking about how you link those two things rather than them being separate. So we've got this context. We've got this context though, where in terms of shopping patterns, because of the impact of the pandemic, we went out. When we did go out, we went out with purpose. So footfall, in terms of people actually wandering around high streets, cities, town centres up and down the country, is still down around 15% to what it was pre-pandemic. But having said that, shop retail performance in many places is actually not down by anywhere near as much as that, because people have actually come in for a reason. They know what they want. They've probably done their research online, and they are shopping with more purpose. So the whole idea that the shop is, it's the end of an era for retailing in town centres and city centres is, I think, a complete sort of misnomer. But having said that, if you think about what the sort of shape of those high streets and town centres and city centres are going to look like in the future, I mean, Lawrence and Andrew have sort of highlighted two sort of structural shifts, and retail sort of sits with, it's an amenity that people want near where they live, or if it's a thing that people will use and engage with if they're working in space in an office that is perhaps nearby. Actually, I think we really need to think about high streets and town centres in a much broader way than just thinking about them in just full of retail. So beyond retail, because retail in physical space terms will be a smaller proportion, but still a really important one, and one where actually it will be as much about sort of transactions and buying things as it will be about service, about actually trying and experiencing new products and services that retailers might offer, as well as actually just physically going in and buying something. So the whole nature of the world of retailing has shifted, and I think the really sort of interesting question, which comes back to the context of today's session, is while all that sort of helicopter view thing was going on, we were also seeing this reversal of a trend pre-pandemic of the sort of flight to big centres, city centres being the sort of the place that everybody wanted to be, to actually the resurgence of local communities and high streets because of the loss of all the the commuters that were actually sitting in many of these city centre offices that Andrew was talking about earlier. So the extent to which that reversal stays in place or goes back the other way is all dependent on the trends that the other two guys have just already highlighted, because certainly from their point of view of, I mean, I live literally in the city of London, so having spent the whole of the last 2 years being around here and seeing the sort of the complete fall off a cliff of the number of people that have left the city and are now sort of slowly coming back, how that reshaping actually ends up landing over the course of the next sort of couple of years. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. and I'm sitting here kind of living in it, and every retailer that you talk to, because it is dependent on what happens to the integration with sort of more people living in cities, what happens to those agile working spaces, when people commute, even the working week might look different, because the idea that we go in Monday to Friday 9 to 5 is sort of, I think, a thing of the past. So there is almost, she says sort of unhelpfully, so many trends all going on to try and be able to sort of land on and the answer is X. I think at this particular point is a complete impossibility. I think what is really important though for towns and particularly for cities is to really try and work out what that means for their particular area, and you can only do that on a sort of location by location basis, and that takes you into all sorts of questions about local leadership, where that comes from, collaboration across different parts of whether it's business, work, retail, leisure, hospitality in those local areas to build something that is relevant to what that community is, rather than trying to answer it on a sort of global national basis.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Helen. I agree with you in a sense. The unfashionable view is it's a little bit too early to tell and we're not quite sure. I completely agree with you on that. And it's always heartens me when I hear others say that as well, rather than be very definitive about what is going to happen. I suppose one of the ways to try and think about where we think some of this might stick or not. Lawrence, maybe come to you first on this. Is the extent to which either the trends or the patterns that you've observed over the last 2 years, in what ways are they significantly different or quite the same as sort of trends that you were seeing in the run up to the pandemic? I think if they are substantively different, we might draw a different set of conclusions about stickiness of those, as opposed to them being essentially continuations of existing trends that we saw pre-pandemic. So how would you characterize the changes in the sort of residential market preferences that you see from your clients and customers? Different or largely the same? How would you think about that? And I'll come to Andrew on that similar sort of question.
I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think if you think back to life as it was before, back in the normal times before 2019, generally speaking, people went they grew up and they went in a sort of pattern. You would leave your family home at 18, either to go find your own place to work somewhere or to go to university. You would meet somebody, you'd move into a flat together, and then after a few years you'd say, okay, we've had enough of this, we want to have a family, we need somewhere with more space, we're going to move out to the suburbs and find somewhere with a bit more room to raise a kid. And then maybe when you've got kid number 2 on the way, you move slightly further out still to get the bigger garden or a bit more space. That process is still going on and was still going on through the pandemic. People were still meeting, people were still forming households, people were still having babies. What's changed, I think, is that whereas before people were getting to their sort of late 20s, early 30s, at the point where they would normally be making that move out to start a family. And instead of saying, oh, it's quite nice having a bit of disposable income and staying in the city centre and renting for a few more years, they're saying, well, everything's shut down, I'm going to make that move 2 years earlier than I would have done previously. That's very much a short-term thing. That's very much a trend that existed through the course of the pandemic, through the course of lockdown, and is one that we don't expect to see now that things are opening up again. So that shift of people moving out of cities earlier than they might have done otherwise, we think has stopped. And as a result, we can expect to see that as we see this next cohort of younger people moving through, a return to that state of they're going to live in city centre flats for longer, to enjoy the amenities, to enjoy the social interaction, to enjoy that buzz that you can get from living in a much denser neighbourhood. I think the other trend that we've got to watch out for, that again the pandemic has shifted rather than changing direction entirely, is what's going on with affordability. One of the reasons we see these younger households renting and not buying in many cases is because there have been restrictions on what they can borrow for a mortgage, and in many locations house prices have been rising far quicker than incomes. That's not changed. and certainly over the course of the pandemic, whether that's because of a stamp duty holiday or whether that's because interest rates were so low, or just because everybody was desperately trying to buy somewhere when the market was still very undersupplied, we've seen house price growth rapidly accelerate. Even in the last 12 months, if you look at the nationwide figures, price growth in excess of 12% year on year. That's something that's really triggered a step change in affordability. It's made it much more difficult for those first-time buyers to access the market, particularly those who don't have some kind of support from the bank of mum and dad. And so that's going to drive that trend beyond this point as we start to see the Bank of England raise rates, as we start to see the cost of living crisis hit and that inflation story hit. That's going to drive people to live in the private rented sector for longer. It's probably going to end up with people living in urban areas for longer, as they don't have the savings, the deposit savings, to go out and buy somewhere as they would have done previously.
I appreciate this is a difficult question. Inability to generalize. Are you seeing this across most the patterns that you were just describing? Cities are sort of slightly bringing forwards of those that were in their 30s thinking about or having children often leave our urban areas. We knew that was a pattern beforehand. Is that a pattern you see across many urban sort of residential markets, or are we talking about a certain small number? I mean, it's a difficult question to kind of generalize on this, but just do we see noticeably different patterns in different urban labour markets or different residential markets, or not?
Yeah, I mean, just generalizing very, very broadly, as you have to with these things.
Yeah.
Those cities where the affordability pressures are greatest, by which I mean generally London and the South, Cambridge is another particular example that jumps out, and those cities that are very dense and where the housing as a result is quite small, it's more likely to be flats, it's more likely to be smaller homes. There you see that greater pressure for people to move out, to seek more space, to get more home for their money. In those less dense urban areas where you see a much greater proportion of terraces rather than flats, for instance, so you're able to access a garden, you're able to access that extra bedroom without leaving the city entirely, there that pressure isn't as great. So there's perhaps, it's a sort of factor of both, as a factor of both density and affordability driving that, the speed at which you're seeing these younger households moving out of cities. If you do have, if we're building cities, if we're living in cities that have suitable family housing and it's not too expensive, then there's no reason for them to leave.
Is it fair to say that where we are seeing these patterns, which again we saw before, if people are moving out of the city itself, they're still sitting or they're still living roughly within the commuter belt, the labour market belt of those cities? They're not moving, some are obviously moving hundreds of miles away to the middle of nowhere, but those are very much exceptions. The bulk of what's going on is essentially leaving the city but staying in the city's labour market. Is that a fair generalization from your data?
I think that's right. When we see people moving, the vast majority of people stay within the same local authority. The next most common move is to the next one local authority over. So when people are making these shifts, they're not, generally speaking, jumping to the other side of the country, or they're not jumping to the middle of the Yorkshire Dales or anything. They're still within that same city's orbit. They're just not quite as closely connected as they would have been previously.
Yeah, great, excellent, fantastic. Andrew, partly a sort of similar question about the nature of the trends that you were talking about. Are they radically different in the last 2 years than not? My sense is probably not, but you'd be interested in your thought on that. And then follow-up question, which I asked slightly earlier on, which was about when you look across the occupier industry or the occupiers more broadly, are you seeing noticeable trends as to which ones are preferencing that kind of inner urban location vis-a-vis other types of businesses that maybe are now looking for different types of locations? Again, I appreciate big questions, but any thoughts on that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I would say you're right, and there's been a lot of commentators talk sped up, and I think for offices anyway. You think back to things like hot desking, and because of that, people were starting to work from home anyway, and starting to use the technology. And there's no doubt that things like Zoom and Teams have speeded that up. But I think the big change for me is the way that office occupiers are now making decisions. So you don't have to go back that far to see that the primary driver was financial. How much is this going to cost? Can we make savings? Desks get smaller, densities get greater, and that was how we were making decisions in a lot of cases. And I think that's the one thing that has changed coming out of the pandemic. We're certainly seeing HR, for example, coming around on viewings, and that occupier experience is a lot higher up the agenda than perhaps it was. Making sure that there's things like amenity is much more important than it was. The quality of the office is a lot more important. So suddenly the financial side is starting to slip down the agenda. So we're seeing that across the board, and that's probably the biggest change. I mean, as I said before, we are in this period of transition. It is too early to make decisions, and a lot of occupiers are taking space relatively short term at the moment. So we are seeing a growth in the flex market. How sustainable that is, only time will tell. That there's possibly a danger once those occupiers get comfortable with their utilization rates and they start to acquire more sustainable buildings for the longer term in the future, as to whether we end up with an oversupply in that area. Only time will tell. So that's the sort of biggest change we've seen in terms of different sectors. I guess one of the bigger surprises was for me towards the end of last year, we're seeing some of the tech companies perhaps moving out of some of the core locations, especially down the M4 corridor. We saw a number of large deals down there. So it feels like at the moment location is driven by the talent, and there's a lot of clustering around universities, for example, especially in the science space. I'm thinking about Cambridge Science Park in particular, where we sold an asset last year. So there is some clustering going on. I would say it is about the talent at the moment and where you can access it, but also it's where you can access those sustainable, high quality buildings where occupiers are ready to sign up for the longer term.
And your thought on, this, obviously the demand is uncertain and variable and changing. And yet there is a supply side initial response maybe on some of those more flex working. But property by definition, offices by definition are durable, very durable, and they take a long time to change. Your thoughts on that? Any lag effects that we might see as the supply side takes maybe a bit longer to respond to changing demand? How does that get played out?
It's a really interesting space, and it's going to be a challenge over the next cycle, and not helped with what's going on in Ukraine and the knock-on effect that's having on inflation in construction costs and the availability of steel. And then balanced, of course, with the sustainability side as well. And should we be knocking down and redeveloping buildings, or should they be repurposed and going down a refurbishment route? So the supply side is really complex at the moment, and there's lots of factors in play, just working out what is the right product to produce, because ultimately, for those longer term deals, they have to be sustainable. That they have to minimise the carbon that goes into them, and from an operational perspective, the energy usage needs to be low. So there is a challenge. I do think there is going to be a big supply demand imbalance through the next cycle, and that will play out in green premiums as we go forward.
Brilliant. Helen, you talked about the bringing together of online and offline, as it were, has kind of challenged different business models, the way that we think about retail and how individual retail businesses are operating between those two channels. what's been the effect, or what do you think the effect is as we come out on the location decisions of the retailers and retail industries between, I don't know, in town, out of town, online, offline, virtual, physical. We hear a lot about those sorts of things. Any thoughts on, the sort of the locational implications of how the retail industry is evolving and how they're responding to customers? What's your thought on that?
Well, it's all follow the money. It's all about cash, isn't it? It's always all about cash. So the whole cost of operation, I think, remains one of the key drivers. So that takes us into debates about the business rate system and how it is not fit for purpose, and I'll wax on about that for the rest of the webinar, but I definitely won't bore everybody with it, because it's a sort of well-rehearsed argument that I think really isn't still sort of fully, well, maybe it is amongst this audience, but how appreciated it is in terms of the it's not like the fundamental thing that sort of impacts any individual decision, but at the margin there are stores that haven't opened or stores that have closed just because of the burden of that tax. So there's a cost of operating, sort of fundamental overarching question, of which business rates is just one part. But I think again, it sort of comes back to what I was saying about the merging of those channels. I think even the way that retailers and we as the BRC, we collect data, and we're still thinking about them as two separate channels, and we're going, well, store sales look like this and online sales look like that, whereas actually more and more individual businesses are looking at the performance of online in a region, in a particular area, and whether or not it depends a bit on the category that they're selling, but whether or not the location of a physical space in that area will actually not just encourage people into that physical space, but will also drive digital traffic as well as physical people. So I suppose that is a very sort of roundabout way of saying the decision-making process is now much more complicated in terms of the parameters that sit around it, and you can't just look in isolation at that one physical space, even though you do need to sort of make money out of it at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Very good. Boris, come in on that thought. I also wanted you to say a little bit more about, seems to me from what you were saying, that the rental market in different places is only going to increase in importance. And then there's a supply side question, which is, can we make that a good quality product and an offer for different households at different points in their life cycle? Am I reading you right from what you were saying? And I guess what's the implications at the city scale for how they might think about and respond to that?
So you're right in that the private rented sector has grown massively in importance, not just through the pandemic, but over the last couple of decades. Its rise has been stopped, in fact, by a variety of government schemes to help people into home ownership. Things like Help to Buy in particular, but also stamp duty relief for first-time buyers. Help to Buy wraps up next year. And without that, despite government efforts, things like First Homes, thinking around the edges, converting affordable housing into effectively a discounted product for first-time buyers, that does suggest that acceleration of households into home ownership earlier is going to stop, and we are going to see an increase in demand for high-quality private rented homes. At the same time, you've got a whole load of legislation and tax changes that have disincentivized buy-to-let landlords. So the flow of rented properties onto the market has been slowing, and in some areas it's falling. How do we square that circle? Well, to some degree, we are going to have to see more investment properties. We are going to have to see more buy-to-let investment coming through. And as that supply becomes more constrained and rents rise, that will encourage more investors into the sector. But in the large part, we believe it's going to be supply coming through as a result of large-scale institutional investors, people like Legal & General, for instance, looking at the private rented sector and saying, well, actually, it's giving me rental growth, it's giving me stable long-term returns. Actually, this is a sector I want to get involved in. And there, that combination of being able to operate at efficiencies of scale and having experience from operating in other sectors, whether that's providing student accommodation or providing retirement housing or providing anything else, that allows them to provide a much better managed, a much more consistent and higher quality product than you're likely to get with just sort of finding property on spare room or Gumtree or something.
Yeah, that's very, yeah.
In terms of what local cities can do to support that, generally speaking, we find local councils do not have an especially good understanding of how built to rent, how this purpose-built rental product works. And so just understanding more of that, looking at successful schemes in other cities and seeing what benefits they bring, I think is a really important first step in being able to bring successful rental communities into new cities across the UK.
Well,
Kelly, go on.
It's all part of that. Again, it comes back to the sort of local leadership point, doesn't it? Because unless there is a real vision of what it is that a city is trying to create in the different parts of it, then you don't have a strategy that sits behind it that gets the right balance of whether it's buy to let or retail in the right place or agile working spaces or whatever it might be. So I think and it's a real intangible thing because it's not something that central government can kind of create with a policy. It's a cultural as well as a resource and capability question.
Yeah, and both your comments touch on questions we've had from Kate Hainsworth in Leeds and Kevin Johnson in Birmingham. Similar sort of questions about, Kevin, what are the consequences of in the way that our cities are managed, how services are delivered, the fabric of our cities, is maintained. And Kate's kind of question is about how do we think across silos or across sectors that often operate in fairly traditional, isolated ways. How do we kind of bring those sorts of things and issues together? Because all of you have talked about both the individual thing, whereas the retail outlet or the home or the office, but actually talked a lot about the external amenities and the external the location in which those things sit is really quite important and adds value or detracts value from that. So I wonder, whether you see that as a new area that should be emphasized more than maybe it traditionally has. Helen, what do you think?
Well, I think unless you've got the right transport links, so the physical infrastructure, the look and feel, so the sort of built environment, the digital infrastructure, broadband, 5G, the whole sort of, how you create sort of smarter cities that are sort of more interconnected. So it's back to that technology point. So a lot of that has got to come sitting across all the things that we've individually been talking about. And that's where, the importance of local authorities really come in, because they're the sort of point that kind of can bring all those different stakeholders together. But I think it's really interesting for sort of particularly for national retailers or for, offices that sit right across the country, of which I suppose there's less. But because national retailers have all been set up to run themselves nationally, not the local person is responsible for their individual delivery rather than playing a role necessarily. So this is what needs to, or is beginning to shift, playing a role in that local community for the wider good, in terms of being part of that collaboration with the local authority, with the other types of businesses, in order to create something that is unique and special to that particular place, that gives people a reason to want to live there or to work there or to visit the retail locations that might be there.
Yeah, and Andrew, coming on this, but I mean, the obvious point to make on that, which I completely agree with Helen's sort of statement of how it needs to happen, and these sort of, the obvious thing from a city's kind of local authorities point of view is they are very, very cash and capacity constrained. They've had a tough 10 plus years on a financial and capacity front. And increasingly, to do some of this stuff, they are very reliant on special pots of money that they have to bid into for government to do anything on, whatever the issues are. Increasingly, that's the modus operandi of the government. So there's a sort of set of capacity and fiscal or financial constraints that in some respects work against what Helen is advocating for. So I'd be interested in your thought about how we might try and square some of that, whether you're optimistic that we can.
I think the opportunity is definitely there, because no longer can we look at all of the sectors. I think Katie used the word siloed in her question, and I think that's right. And I think that the link has to be made between the benefits of a mixed use city centre for all of those uses. And I mean, I'm thinking about offices and the weight that is being put on amenity and the expectation of occupiers coming into offices to be able to benefit from that amenity. And I'm not just talking about perhaps retailing, I'm thinking about social value and those sorts of uses, because we're not far away now, I think, where occupiers will expect to see within office buildings some sort of social use. And they want to be part of that. And the next generation of workers that are coming through that have been, talking about sustainability for a long time now.
Do you think that will become a material consideration, Andrew, rather than, I've ticked all the boxes and then my last box is those kind of, do you get a sense that it will become much more of a priority, further up the decision-making chain?
I think it will get to a point you won't be able to lease buildings unless you've done it. I think that's a little way away, but yeah, I think that's now a possibility. I mean, we've already seen how quickly the carbon agenda has moved, and we're almost at a point now where it will become more difficult to sell buildings that haven't got the right roadmap in place. So yeah, I do think that having that mixed use and thinking about the wider picture, I mean, there's a lot of really good developers out there that are doing some excellent placemaking and starting to bring this together in certain schemes. And I think that it will become easier to justify it from a commercial perspective.
Laura, so kind of residential perspective on, do you see that in terms of the preferences that people are making in terms of where they are and where they look at, there's an amenity bonus, or there's a mixed use bonus that we can already see, and we think that will strengthen over time?
I think it was either a mayor or a deputy mayor of Paris who started talking a little while ago about the 15-minute city. And I can see you smiling and nodding there. This has come up a lot in the discussion here as well. Having the ability to access your place of work, somewhere to shop, somewhere to go out and relax, your kids' school, all within a short walk or a very short journey of your home, is something that people find incredibly valuable. Not having to jump in a car and drive for half an hour to get you to do your weekly shop is actually really pretty spectacular, honestly. So I think that's something that people are becoming more and more conscious of, and that's going to affect the sorts of residential properties, the sorts of locations that people are going to want to live in going forward. Particularly having had this experience of the pandemic, really emphasizing the importance of getting out there in person, of doing that face-to-face interaction at the office or at your place of work, of going out and feeling the clothes that you're buying, of seeing and smelling the food that you're about to buy, rather than just sort of trying to get an impression of what might be about to arrive when you go on Deliveroo. So I think this is definitely going to be driving residential choices for the long term, not just short term.
And Andrea, start with you, because you talked about it, and again, it's intrinsic in comments about this aspect of quality, the desire and demand for quality, however it's expressed in different ways. I suppose, from starting with you, what's the implications for secondary or tertiary either buildings or locations that are not in that at the higher echelons of the sort of quality offer? What does that mean for them in the short run, or in the medium term? What's your view on that? I get Helen to come in from a retail, because retail is often as a kind of hierarchical, destinational sort of model. Whether that continues and what that means for if you're not at the top, what does that mean? But Andrew, just give us it from an office and occupier perspective first.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, historically, of course, every occupier will have a price point, and not every occupier will want to be historically taking the best office and the best locations, because their budgets just won't work. Unfortunately, we're very fast heading towards a point where if those offices can't get to a certain standard, I'm thinking particularly about EPCs, B-rated EPCs, or C-rated by 2028, B-rated by 2030. And if they can't get to that, then those owners will have to start thinking about, changes of use, and certainly, and where they can get to it, they will have to put those improvements in place. So you are going to see over the next cycle a general increase in the quality of that stock, and that will be fed. It will have to be fed through into rents. So, and that's just inevitable. And I guess that's the big change that we've got now that we've never had before.
Yeah, and the ability to transition from one to the next in part is determined by the end use value or price. And if the price isn't there, then the process of transition is going to be less profitable, or the incentives are not going to be as strong, right? Yeah. Helen,
exactly.
Helen, you're kind of reflect, this quality kind of and flight to it, or demand for it. What does it mean for those places that, for whatever reason, for different reasons, can't get to that threshold or that level? What's their future in that, from a retail and engagement perspective?
Well, I think it translates slightly differently in a retail context, because it's yes, it will be, obviously location is always important, but it's, again, it comes back to this point about the sort of evolving role of the store as not just something where you just go in to undertake a transaction to buy a good. So that yes, there will be a convenience sort of local element to it. So that's about location. But what about the actual experience that you undergo in that physical space? The sort of the service that is actually offered in it, the sort of showroom brand building element in terms of the product offer, and how you really build more engagement rather than just a transactional engagement, a sort of much broader sort of loyalty driving engagement with customers. And so I think the definition of what a sort of quality, a flight to quality means is in the context of retail is if that can be got right for the particular customer base. And again, there's no sort of one size fits all, because it depends what category you're in, what part of the market you're in, and how that manifests itself. But if that can be got right with the relevant customer base for a particular retail business, then you that should mean success, potentially less dependent on the quality of location and sort of physical fit out of the space. But I think Andrew's point about the sort of sustainability agenda is one that is as relevant in retail as it is in pretty much every other, I think, industry, including the one that he's highlighted, in the sense of whether it's the products or the that built environment. People are, while it's still very important, there's still sort of marginal the extent to which they actually make a decision to buy something differently on the back of it. But that is not so far away at all now either. So I think that has got to be front of mind, as well as that totality of what experience might mean in a physical space.
Lawrence, you're similar sort of where we are on the process of introducing that sort of quality aspect, and when it becomes a material consideration, I suppose, but in part, what does that mean for places with residential stock, either current or potential, that is not where it should be on the quality spectrum? What's your kind of reflections on that?
I think we've run into the situation where everybody's branded themselves as being a luxury development, which is makes it very difficult to distinguish anything, honestly. I think we've got to be very careful about how we think of quality, because different people will have different definitions and different priorities. If you are a long-term institutional investor, your definition of quality will mean that the fixtures and fittings, that the carpets that you've installed, that the worktops that you've installed and so on, have to be of a higher quality, because you are looking at this home as an investment over the next 20, 30 years. If you are selling to a first-time buyer, that's not as much of a priority. They would rather you kept the costs low so they could afford to buy it and move in quicker, but they will care more about the quality of the local amenity offering and their connection to the local schools, the creches, the places of work and so on. And it just reinforces something that we've come across, I think, in some of the questions that we've had coming in that, and the Helen's point earlier as well, and that all of this stuff needs to be considered and designed and marketed within that local context. What works in one city is not going to work in another. And so having that contextual awareness is incredibly important for making sure that we're building the right kind of homes and ultimately the right kind of offices and shops that people want to occupy and work in and shop in for the future.
Excellent. Well, we are very close to 1 o'clock and we could carry on, but I'm afraid we can't. That's been super interesting. I've learned loads more to think about. So thank you very much to my panelists, Helen Dickinson, Andrew Mercer and Lawrence Bowles. Thank you very much for all of you for joining, and for those that posted questions, thank you very much for that. You can find all the work that we've been doing on the pandemic and its impact on cities and towns across the country on our website, centreforcities.org. But for now, until the